Thanks, Billy. So this talk is really based on some of my PhD work which I've published and some work I do with the consulting company I work for, so to illustrate some of the points. So in the first instance I'd like to look at one of the recent population papers that got a bit of coverage, looking at population through the last 50,000 years. I'm then going to look at a recent one that looks at the spatial analysis of some of the archaeology with a focus on Last Glacial Maximum. And then I'll go into a couple of projects that HMS, the company I work for, has been involved in that I think illustrate some of the points quite well. My email's at the end of this. If anyone's interested in the papers I talk about or in this, I can send it on later. So my PhD is very much, hopefully nearing the end, and is very much based on radiocarbon data. So I'm using radiocarbon data from archaeological sites as a proxy for human activity, specifically population. And there are a whole lot of limitations and assumptions with that, which thankfully we don't have time to go into, but I can elaborate later. And ultimately, so anywhere an archaeologist has dated a hearth, a burial, a midden, a cooking pit, you name it, we have a date. Overall, we have 5,041 dates from 1,750 sites. And I've used that data set in various ways to look at Aboriginal activity and occupation through time. The earliest data set is Devil's Lair down here, 49,000 on a hearth, interestingly. Obviously Mungo, we've got Malacandra up through here. So a range of sites dominated by the Holocene. And the use of radiocarbon data as a proxy has been around since the 80s. Rick first did it in South America. In Australia, Mike Smith and a fellow Sharp in '93 started the process looking at Pleistocene dates and what it meant, and then Holdaway and Porch did some work in Tasmania looking at this same sort of deal through Tasmania. So it's been around a while, but really it's reaching its golden age in the last sort of 5-6 years where methods have been developed, tested, played with, and I think we've got a really good handle. It's one of the few proxies that can look regionally and nationally at Aboriginal occupation and an archaeological signal. You can combine them all and produce a curve which shows something rather than a number of sites locally looked at. This is just showing the various climate regimes, so we've got the tropics, the arid zone, the temperate area and the southern oceans. Not so much relevant to this paper, interesting to see the spread and surprisingly a large number in the arid zone, as you can see. So temporally this is the curve we see, so I'll run you through it. The black bars are the open sites, so any sites, middens, artefacts, scatters, campsites. The white bars are rock shelter dates, so they're all from rock shelters, and they've been calibrated because radiocarbon has an issue with atmospheric C14, so they've been calibrated to produce a date and then binned into 200-year intervals to give the curve you see. And what's been interesting in the last few years is the ability to correct these dates for taphonomic loss, so the loss of older sites through time, applying an equation that was produced by Todd Sorrell and others in America, and there are limitations with it, to correct this curve to try and produce something that's taphonomically corrected through time. And there are limitations, and certainly I think one of the key things is anything beyond about 30,000 years it really overcorrects for. Otherwise there were millions and millions of people there from day one, not so much recently, which is highly unlikely. So the paper was really looking at the debate first proposed by Joseph Birdsall in the 50s, I think, which was looking at how people had got to Australia and colonised Australia. And his belief was that they had actually colonised it and populated it incredibly quickly. More recently there's been studies or papers by Laura Jones Smith, Jim Beaton and Harry Larandis to do with how the populations remained low through the Pleistocene, so low until 10,000 years ago and then expanded in the last few thousand years. Larandis' work was based on social intensification, but that's kind of been mixed up more recently in economic intensification. And so that was the study, and this study really shows that populations were fairly low until about the early Holocene, and then they took off quite exponentially in stepwise fashion. Certainly these levels were comparable with the mid-Holocene, which is generally a new finding. It's certainly quite interesting. This peak here is to do with the Murray-Darling, and one of the issues with radiocarbon dates is you get particular individuals that focus on one area and continuously date the same area. And so the Murray-Darling, which Willandra Lake system you've just heard about, is all Pleistocene. It's all about 20,000 years old. So every time somebody dates a hearth or a midden or a burial, we get a date, and suddenly you have a huge peak in a period that the Last Glacial Maximum, which is incredibly dry and in general across the country was very sparsely populated, and I'll go into that in a couple of slides. So this is very much a qualitative approach, and the next couple of slides I'll turn to a quantitative approach. Well, just one final word is one of the more interesting findings recently made by Fernand and others who I work with in James Cook Uni, is that a lot of things we've always assigned to late Holocene, fish traps, rock art, those sort of things, have all generally been assigned to the late Holocene, whereas now there's a number of sites that show it's more like the early Holocene, along with what we see is quite an increasing population through this period in this graph. And we do see quite a large number of changes that have always been assigned to this most recent period. Don't get me wrong, a lot still happens in the last 4,000 or 5,000 years due to primarily El Nino, but I think some of these things are happening earlier, which is quite interesting. So look, I'll get to the next one, which makes a bit more sense. So this is the same graph, but we've got rid of the Murray-Darling, and just so to run you through it, we have these fairly low numbers, quite low, the last glacial maximum. The lowest times actually through the terminal Pleistocene, 16,000, 14,000, and the reason we believe for that is that along with the incredibly dry period through here, we're now seeing improving conditions, and so it actually would have been much drier, much hotter. So not only do we have the cool aridity, we've now got hot aridity, and certainly around this period here, and I'll come into the graph in a sec, we see some of the lowest levels of Aboriginal population for a long, long time. We then see this increasing population through the early Holocene, some of the best climate Aboriginal people ever saw in Australia, very hot, very humid, great conditions, and this I think probably led to the technological shifts we see much more recently. We've got a large population, probably well over the carrying capacity typically of Australia, and we then have El Nino kicks off the ENSO cycles, and we get much, much drier through here, 4,000 to 2,000 incredibly dry, and during that time we see massive increases in mobility of Aboriginal people, we see composite toolkits, we see a range of adaptations to dry conditions, and I think far more than we ever see at the Last Glacial Maximum, which is a much bigger event. So this is probably a result of massive amounts of population that have grown early in the Holocene. So we took that curve, and Matthew Perros in Canada basically turned it into birth rates. So I did the same thing here, and it's quite interesting to see. Again, we have sort of various boom and bust cycles, which is quite common for a hunter-gatherer society. But again, the Last Glacial Maximum, just after Last Glacial Maximum, we see big plummets in birth rates. We see it again at the Antarctic cold reversal, around 14,000 to 12,000, which is another step back into the glacial. And we see this stepwise increase through the Holocene, with the highest amounts being the last couple of thousand years, which is quite a common archaeological signal. And the average of that over 50,000 years is 0.01%, with a range, as you can see there, a maximum amounts of 1.84. And when you look at ethnographic studies, so probably one of the best ones is by Pennington. She looked at both South America and Africa, found a number, and explored the last 90,000 years of birth rates, and she came up with these sort of values, which is close to the range, probably a bit more extreme at the top end. Johnson and Brooke recently did some work where they modelled the exercise and come up with something fairly similar. So an interesting curve, again showing the impact of the Last Glacial Maximum and the intensification or increasing population in the late Holocene, which is what I'll come to in the next few slides.
What's that a percentage of?
It's an annual birth rate per year, worked out through the radiocarbon data. So it's an annual change, really, a percentage annual change. And so, as Billy's alluded to, using that equation I then applied actual figures. And the aim was to try and explore contact populations. Radcliffe Brown was the first to look at this and come up with values around 300,000, though he suggested it was a minimum using ethnographic data. Laura Jane Smith followed him and came up with fairly similar conclusions. But the fly in the ointment was Butland and Campbell, who both believed that smallpox had a massive impact to Aboriginal populations, either at contact or Campbell believed probably before contact with trephangers from the north. And they believe values of 1.2 million were more likely. So big differences in numbers, and then Mulvaney White, probably before myself, was the last to really focus on this issue, and they sort of took the mid-ground. And so I put a range of population numbers in at founding populations to try and reproduce these sort of values. And again, so what we find to end up with a population around 700,000 to 1.1. Sorry, step back a sec. There's no chance we can work something out where there's a 50,000-year-old civilization that's only that large. So the lowest figures we were seeing were 500,000, 600,000. To get values around this, we have to have a founding population of 1,000 to 2,000, probably more like 2,000 to 3,000. This is assuming one or very closely arranged voyages. Obviously, people may have come here in dribs and drabs over many, many centuries. That's just the nature of the technique. And we see The highest populations are 500 years ago, which is quite interesting. That's archaeological, that stacks up. Sydney, there's a number of large-scale archaeological sites, 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago, 500 years ago, and then it does seem to drop off, and then at contact we have drop off. So that was an interesting exercise and suggests that some of these figures are okay. And now I want to move on to the spatial analysis of the data set, and one of the things we looked at is the Last Glacial Maximum, where people were during the Last Glacial Maximum. And this was a large debate in the 80s, late 80s. Mike Smith, Peter Hiscock, Peter Veth all had large discussions and many journals about how people were moving around and surviving through the Last Glacial Maximum. And this is probably the most famous, the islands in the interior, where Peter Veth identified a number of refuges or refugium where people could have survived some of the most driest conditions Australia's ever seen. And obviously also we have barriers where he believed people could not cross. So we took the data set and we did some cluster analysis and minimum boundary rectangles. This is presented a little bit differently in the paper, and I don't expect you to see it all here, but in effect we looked at the radiocarbon and we basically said, how do these dates cluster together? And that gave us a cluster centroid, a central part where these clusters formed, and then we looked at the area that the radiocarbon dates form the cluster in, so a minimum boundary rectangle this is. And that gave us a proxy for occupied territory or ranging territory for Aboriginal people. What was interesting, and we looked from 26,000 all the way through to 12,000, and what was interesting is a number of places keep popping up. So, there's an area in Gulf of Carpentaria here where there's very stable conditions throughout the terminal Pleistocene. Interestingly, Pat McConville sort of suggests that the Pamanunga language, the Proto-Aboriginal language, came out of this region, potentially in the early Holocene, so perhaps a unimpacted society by the LGM perhaps was one of the reasons it came from that direction. All speculation, very interesting. Murray-Darling, Willandra Lake system again, very consistent. Tasmania. These are an artefact of the data set. They're dragging the Margaret River data, the Warren bioregion data, with the Pilbara data, and probably never really interacted, but they've dragged all of the census points south. And so through that we came up with a model, and it actually mimics Peter Veth's quite well. So 30 years on, we still kind of agree with him. We've used bioregions from the CSIRO Institute of Bioregional Regionalisation of Australia to try and pick these things up a little more accurately than just some hand-drawn circles. And so these are really regions we felt were refuges through the terminal Pleistocene, all that climatic deterioration. And I guess the reasons why, we had to speculate some of the reasons why. A lot of these, and Tasmania, probably relate to increased snowmelt. The Australian Alps, Blue Mountains all have a lot more snow, a lot more ice. Some had glaciers. In some of these things would have melted, feeding all the river systems. So that's one of the key reasons the Murray-Darling, the Willandra Lake system was doing so well. So we've clearly got rivers. Interestingly, the Sydney Basin, which I'll come to in a little while, has the Hawkesbury, which also is fed through the Blue Mountains and probably was consistent through this period. The other reasons we think are subdued vegetation in Tasmania. Certainly the rainforest was subdued in the Last Glacial Maximum and led to great hunting grounds. And we see as the Holocene, as the rainforest comes back, Aboriginal people abandon the regions. Some of Dortch and Wright suggest there's similar issues in the Margaret River region. And then we have no real idea why these ones are maintained, as Billy suggested, and it's quite well recorded. The monsoon's pretty much stopped, so you'd imagine the tropics wouldn't be a nice place to live, but there was weak and episodic rainfall, quite extreme rainfall through that period, but fairly rare. And then the Brigalow Belt probably relates to the headwaters of the Darling River, and that seemed to actually be fairly consistent through the Last Glacial Maximum. It never really dried up. But yeah, a few questions still, but very interesting. And something we can then do with the minimum boundary rectangles is actually add them all up and work out an overall territory, ranging territory for people to have been living in and moving around in. And interestingly, we see, again, Last Glacial Maximum, some of the lowest levels, only 1 million square kilometres, supposedly a 7 million square kilometre country. Again, it's a little bit qualitative, there's a lot of assumptions. We see again a drop off at just after the Last Glacial Maximum, and again we see a decline around the Antarctic cold reversal, so with expansion in between. And this is stuff we're actually working on now, so we've taken that same process, we've tweaked it a little bit, still work in progress, looking at the Holocene. And again you see from 13, 12,000 years, we see this increasing use of the landscape. note the scales, 2 million, 10 million, it's a much bigger area being used, probably through the expansion of the arid zone. We do see a lot of increases in use of the arid zone from about 8,000. We see a kick, so this is minimum boundary rectangles, this is convex hull. Same idea, different methods to do it. And then we see quite a sharp increase through 4 to 2 when ENSO kicks off, and again a lot of studies show increased mobility, people moving in the landscape a lot more to survive. We do see that quite sharply here. The interesting thing I find is this dip, which seems to come across all of the different methods around 2000, and I don't have an answer for it, why at this stage. It is the driest part of the ENSO cycle. It's the most arid time Australia's had in the Holocene. It could reflect population crash. It could be a shift to logistical mobility. There is discussion how people change their mobility patterns, although that's a little bit late. You see grindstones and things appearing at 3 and 4, Chile all these things that suggest a change in mobility patterns. So don't know, but it's something we're working on at the moment, and quite interesting, quite different to the usual trends. So now I want to move on to a couple of sites AHMS has dug over the last several years to sort of illustrate some of these points and see what it looks like on the ground. The first one I want to go to is in Pitt Town. This has been residential development through here and here. This is a cleary precinct, they call it, Thornton and Fernand. It's on the ridgeline overlooking the river, and on the edge of the ridgeline is a sand dune, probably deposited by fluvial methods, but I'll go and stand a bit. We started at Cleary in 2008, and we've slowly worked around, done some testing through here, and I'll talk about 2 specific test pits. And then we did a large excavation in Fernand, which produced some quite exciting results. And the reason I bring them up is they all appear to be terminal Pleistocene, Last Glacial Maximum. So I'll get into that a little bit further. But they're all from that period of refugium on the Hawkesbury River, probably fed by snowmelt and using locally derived resources. So lots of photos. Initially, the Cleary precinct was dug. It was a 5 by 5 metre hole. We dug it in 50 centimetre squares, 5 centimetre spits, very carefully, very slowly. Combination of archaeologists and Aboriginal stakeholders with us, and we got to depths of about 1.2 metres. As you can see, it's all quite a clay sand from the surface, not very disturbed. You'll see the river in the background, very close to the Hawkesbury River. And we published this in 2012 because it was an interesting site, and so we took a number of, the key things was a number of OSL dates, not commonly used, widely available globally, but not commonly used outside of academia in Australia, so it's quite an interesting exercise. And we found 3 key layers of occupation, 2 made out of a tuff, a grey volcanic type stone, all out of river cobbles, probably from the river, and I'll show you some photos of those in a sec. 2 of these, and in the upper layers we've got a silkrete dominated assemblage, probably of the late Holocene age, backed blades, materials classic to the last few thousand years, and standardisation and mobility. Here's a few photos of the finds. These are the tuff artefacts at the base, all sort of just broken cobbles, fairly rudimentary materials, very rudimentary tools. And then in the upper layers we start seeing back blades used for composite tools, which again are classic sort of 4 to 2,000 year materials. This one threw us because it's a back blade made out of tuff, not silkrete. So we came to the conclusion that some of the cobbles that were clearly knocking around the river would perhaps used much later in the piece if they were left on the surface. The reason we believe for the change between tuff and silkrete is because these things are from gravel beds in the Hawkesbury, which would have been running lower in the terminal Pleistocene. The sea level was lower, means the river was lower, and as the sea level rose, the gravels were buried by Hawkesbury River alluvial flats. So locally derived material all around the river, people living there. But there were a number of questions we had, how the sand formed. It was still a very small assemblage, maybe 1,300 artefacts. So there was a lot of questions left in 2008 when we finished that. So what to do? Dig bigger. So this is the Fernand precinct. We started with geophysical work looking for hearths, cooking pits. The issue with OSL is it dates the sand, not the artefacts, and there's always a question of where the artefacts come from. So we did a whole lot of geophys, found absolutely nothing. Sorry, we found 100 anomalies, all of which are fence posts. So we did a whole lot of... Sorry?
Something, just history.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Really recent history, like a decade. So a whole lot of testing, ended up digging two open areas, which total about 100 square metres, which is fairly big for the salvage. Same methods, again, Aboriginal people, archaeologists, we were out there for a few months. And again, sand, all sand. So and ultimately we dug to 2.5 metres. And you can see the scale, there's a car there, so it gives you an idea of the area we looked at. 2 key areas. Ironically, there is a half which we didn't find with the geophys, but we found through the digging. So, and that path is probably the only secure date we have on the Holocene assemblage, which is I'll get to the next slide, I think it's about 1500 years old. So we'll just take a moment on this. This is about 18 months of my life right here. So this is all of the excavations we've done at Pitt Town, summarised through their artefacts. And again, you see this consistent tough assemblage, terminal Pleistocene, moving into Silcrete in the Holocene. Not a clear break. The top 40 or 50 centimetres is very bite-spaced. It was orcharding, it was pastoral, so I think anything above that you sort of have to question. The Fernand, which we recovered over 8,000 artefacts from, is quite exciting because we actually have dates on this peak, 36,000 quite consistently. And that's the earliest dates in Sydney, by the way. It's actually one of the earliest sites in Australia. We haven't read it up yet, but we will be. And the other interesting peak is here, where we have 21,000, again bracketed, which is Last Glacial Maximum. So we believe people were living here through the climatic deterioration, probably using the Hawkesbury River as a refugium, effectively. So yeah, ultimately we have about 10,000 artefacts across the precinct. So this is the Thornton precinct. Same deal, a couple of test bits. Again, we have dates of 30 at the very base of the test bits, with the brackets, maximum minimum age of 14 on this peak here. So interestingly, Cleary, which is this one, which we did publish, we actually pulled back the age depth model to reflect this peak at about 15,000. We were quite conservative in the paper, but when you actually run an age depth model or an alternate age depth model, you actually end up with a date of about 33,000, which, given some of the findings here and here, may be more realistic. So very exciting area, and clearly well used by Aboriginal people in the terminal Pleistocene, but then very subdued in the Holocene, suggesting that it was used when it was needed, but at the moment it wasn't. People moved on. And this is just a very brief one on the soils. This is a particle size analysis of that 2.5 metre core, and again we find that the actual sand body started forming 143,000 fluvially, probably, given the amount of coarse material. We do see these peaks, which are probably more like a wind-blown aeolian, windy environment coming through as we get into the Last Glacial Maximum and just after the Last Glacial Maximum. So generally an increasing trend to wind-blown. One of the big questions we've got is these assemblages seem to all fit together. They're all looking like they're on the land surface, but we can't actually find the land surface. So we've thrown everything we can at it to try and work it out, and we still haven't got an answer. So moving on, this is the last area I want to talk about. This was a site we dug with Matthew Kelly, did the historical work, I said I'd point out, in Newcastle, at the Palais Royale site. This is Hunter Street, near the Northern Highway, Great Northern Railway. It had a bit of bad press when it was done, fairly bad reported, to be honest. It was, bearing in mind this is how the site actually looks when it was started, not exactly the pristine Aboriginal site we're led to believe. Under the current guidelines, we would never have dug there in the first place. The due diligence we looked at now and said disturb, forget about it. So it really put Newcastle on a map, this site. Aboriginal people were involved, state government was involved, development was redesigned to avoid impacts. The largest impacts of that site was actually the archaeological work. So quite badly reported, a very interesting findings. So we ultimately dug a 16 by 3 metre hole in the corner. This is Hunter Street. This is Hunter Street, Steel Street here, so right in the middle of the CBD. And we got down to 2 metres. Again, Aboriginal land people present, archaeologists present, state government representatives are present. And there's also an interesting history on the site as well, which I don't know about. Sorry about that. And again, we took some OSL samples. What we have, so this pit is this pit. So what we have at 2 metres depth is a beach deposit, so which we dated to mid-Holocene, so sea level rose. And within that are artefacts. So we've actually got artefacts we believe come from before that event, which we've dated to 6,500. So possibly some very old artefacts. We have strand lines from flooding, probably from Cottage Creek, and then we have these bodies of sand, probably 2 of them, which date to somewhere around 2,000 at the top to about 4,000 at the bottom. So it's late Holocene, slap bang in the middle of the El Nino, dry periods, and we've got archaeology through it. So it tells us something a little bit about the archaeology. It was actually pure sand, so actually keeping it upright was very hard. And you can see that by the end of the job, the sections were looking a bit ropey. That's the final trench, and you see it. We've had claps all the way through. This area here is actually an old iron pan, which we believe comes from a dune system earlier than the one we're looking at. So probably what's happened is the seas come through and actually washed that dune system away and put all the archaeology that was in it into the beach facies at the bottom of this. So this is just a summary of what we found. Again, we believe we had an older dune system, beach deposits, and 2 different layers of dune formation. In terms of archaeology, it was almost exclusively Nobby's Tuff, Merriweather Churt, whatever you want to call it. Literally just around the corner. I think we found 5,500 artefacts, of which about 5,300 of them were Nobby's Tuff. So really localised use. See some of the cobbles they've pulled out of the ocean. Two different main types of chert, very smooth and sharp tuff and a water rolled tuff, which you could sort of tell. Again, probably there's two different sources of Nobby's tuff. There's actually the stuff off the beach and there's the stuff off the hilltop. So it depends where they got it from. We did have some of these older, well-worn materials, which then were in the beach fasces, which again we believe were quite old, perhaps reworked from a previous time. We suggested perhaps they could have been Pleistocene. And you can see some of the densities we had. I think one test bit had about 430 artefacts in it, which is some of the highest densities I've ever seen. You see the dates. Unfortunately, we had some reversals through here, but again we've got the beach deposits date to about 6.5 into the dune sands, which start around 2 and go through to 3. The age depth more suggests it's in more like 4,000. And again, just in terms of late Holocene intensification, we see low numbers all the way through, and you get peaks. You get peaks as the MSA really kicks off. And the highest occupation, the highest activity on this site, whether you look at it by numbers or by weight, this is 9 kilos of material here versus under a kilo here. So, and the most number of tools are from here. I think we found 75% of all the tools, the backed blades, the composite tool materials are all coming from this period. So clearly this site was increasingly used. Probably the sea level sorted itself out through time. And again, just demonstrates some of what that late Holocene intensification looks like. And that is about it. Oh, question. Oh. Is it for Billy?
Now, I don't mean to belittle what you're doing. Just looking and knowing nothing about it, I've got no expertise in this, but looking at the first premise, and I accept what you're doing, there's radioactive dating, a number of events or number of samples you've had. And then from that graph, from the first couple you say, then that's proportional to population, and which I would say big question mark. Because it really depends on the number of samples you take and where you take them, and there's so much randomness in that sampling that comes from a statistical aspect. And it's not a large number of statistical samples I presume you're taking. You also at the same time acknowledge that by saying that there's an anomaly with respect to the Murray River, and you dismiss that, and I would say rightfully so. But I'd say there must be a caveat on everything you do here. In terms of, and I'm not trying to dismiss you, I'm saying you're trying to work on very limited information, but there needs to be a big caveat. It is very subjective as to what you take there. Equally so when you look at, say, what you did up in Newcastle or even Pitt Town, a number of the peaks you get a number of artefacts is also related to the randomness of where you take your sampling. If you took another sample 100 metres away or 200 metres away, you may have ended up with a different result. And my question would be, how do you qualify in either your PhD or in archaeological records the fact that this is only indicative and it's the best that possibly can be done under the circumstances, but it needs to be qualified, doesn't it?
Yeah, look, I mean, every paper that I've talked about has assumptions and limitations, and one of the key things is how the radiocarbon relates to the archaeological record and human activity. There are a lot of dates, especially in the arid zone, where people just date charcoal wherever they can get hold of it because it's so rare. There have been a number of statistical studies, I've done them myself, that try and correlate both. We call it the trials of charcoal, which is charcoal that just comes from an archaeological site, and sites that actually directly relate to a human event, so a burial, a cooking pit. So we know people have been there and have done it at that time, and they actually show broadly comparisons. So, but no, there are limitations. It's a proxy. It's one of many. Artefact discards and artefact numbers is another proxy. It's just how archaeology works. The Pitt Town stuff I'm actually fairly confident about because we've dug in 3 completely different areas and found the same results. So I think Pitt Town's probably a bad example, but Palé's equally. Yeah, we could have put a hole just around the corner and found nothing. In fact, the site actually next door was dug a bit before we got there and did find nothing. So that's 4 metres away, completely empty. So yeah, it is. There are limitations, as with everything. Radiocarbon is one proxy. Artefact numbers are another. Density of charcoal, density of sedimentation rates. They're all different things. They've all got their own issue. I just happen to be looking at radiocarbon.
The fascination of Australian archaeologists with the opportunities that exist up in the Northern Territories is an obvious one, and certainly is very fascinating. But I was wondering to what extent, I mean, you showed a particular chart that from Monash, which indicated the connections with Papua New Guinea. I've done some historical research in Papua New Guinea quite a bit. One of the fascinating things that came up is that in the rivers in New Guinea, particularly in New Guinea rather than the Papuan side, the early gold miners kept coming across mortars. We're talking about mortars that are this big and gouged out chromatic granite or something like that. The local people have no memory, no connect whatsoever with these. They have no understanding of what they could possibly be, and it's completely alien to any known culture in the last 5,000-6,000 years at all. And I was just wondering to what extent there has been any effort made to link Australian archaeology with discoveries, early discoveries, and I'm talking earlier than perhaps 5,000 years, in Papua New Guinea, where clearly there are some discoveries being made, clearly equally the place is far more difficult to excavate than it is in Australia. But I was just wondering to what extent there is some effort to connect the work that's being done in Australia with some of the archaeological work which I understand has been done, particularly of an older period. Now, I mean, everybody knows about Lapita ware and the like, which is going back 3,000-4,000 years, whatever. I'm talking about earlier than that, very much prehistory. Do you have any views, either of you, on this?
Look, I've read some genetic studies that suggest that the Papua New Guineans actually split off from Australians, Aboriginal Australians, quite early, 40,000 years sort of early, and there was no communication with them after that. So I think
the land bridge did look to be.
Well, this is the interesting point. They weren't landlocked. They weren't separated until Lake Carpentaria, Gulf Carpentaria, which was 8,000 perhaps.
Yeah.
So despite the fact that they actually had land connection for 30,000 years, genetically they were very distinct and never actually connected. So I haven't done a lot of work in Papua New Guinea. There's a number of archaeologists, ANU especially, that do quite a bit. James Cook Uni as well, I think Sue McIntyre-Tamlin, one of our associate directors, has also done work up there. So, but I don't know if there's a lot of crossover between actually Australian archaeological record and the Papua New Guinea archaeological record. But clearly similar things. I mean, we have grindstones and mortars and things in the arid zone, especially in Australia.
Yeah.
Perhaps not on that scale, but certainly it's I assume a similar products produced. So, yeah, interesting.
I think I'll take that a bite of that question too. One thing, I mean, that there isn't a whole lot of contact necessarily, as Al's suggesting, between Papua New Guinea and Australia because of this rugged mountain range. You've got this incredibly rugged mountain range which forms a greater barrier in a way, open sea, deep sea, which says a lot in itself about these cultures. The cultures were a sea culture, a boat culture, more than a climbing culture. The other question, which another part of that question is that culture, of course, changes so quickly. I mean, we look back a couple of hundred years ago and it looks like another world. And if you extend that over a few thousand years ago, the continuities are few and the differences are vast. So I'll be fascinated to learn more about those large mortars you're talking about. There's also the possibility that it was their direct ancestors that were using them, and they just it's something that's slipped out of tradition, has been forgotten, and then rediscovered later.
One other area where there is a connection, it seems to me, are fish traps, which they have in a number of places in New Guinea, which of course they do in Australian archaeology as well. And so it's just interesting whether there's a natural development in both places, a natural way of trapping fish, or whether there is in fact some common cultural connection, if you like, going back. And I have no idea if that is or anything like that, but just interesting.
I've got a query. Do you know anything about, you've heard the theory whereby in sand dunes, which of course with prevailing winds progress in one direction depending which part of the Australian desert you look at. Have you ever heard of Aborigines burying their dead in the fall of the sand dune and in the lead then finding them later? And why I say that is because I've seen it. I used to work out around the Nindi, which is up from Lake Mungo, which is some couple of hundred kilometres from Lake Mungo, I guess. But you would find you'd find skeletons or remnants of skeletons on the lee side exposed after moderate winds and the like, which it seemed to be the case, and it was the local theory And whether it was any basis, I don't know. I've never read it, but it just seemed peculiar that it seemed to, the evidence seemed to match the theory of the locals.
Contemporary, there is burials exposed at Willandra Lakes and the World Heritage Area quite regularly, and the Aboriginal people go out and rebury them often. So I guess that as contemporary terms, it does happen. I don't know if there was a deliberate reason why it would have been done, or whether it was accidental. I guess an understanding of the dunes may not have been as understood back in the past by Aboriginal people as we do understand them today. So potentially the time from a dune to bury someone to actually when it actually moves to a point you can see them could be quite significant, could be generational. So perhaps a complete accident. I know really of the Willandra Lake system, perhaps some of the Murray-Darling, where it probably has occurred. I'm sure it's occurred elsewhere, but I've not come across it. Commonly we see it on the dunes along the oceans, New South Wales especially, Lapperouse, Botany Bay, Cornell. It's a virtually a weekly basis. I understand for people to go out and find pieces of remains out of dunes that have been eroded away.
Looking at the photographs from up in Northern Territory and to a lesser degree in New South Wales, I just wonder how you get away with cutting vertical sides of such depth with respect to current OHS requirements. For instance, in New South Wales, it's 1.5 limit, and then that depends on your soil type into the sandy soil. And I can understand why you're doing it, but I would also say in the mind, taking what happened up in the Northern Territory on your deep one, why don't you change your whole thinking? I can see why you would do it on a two-dimensional or three-dimensional basis, X, Y and Z axes. But if you cut it in a circular manner, you've got far less chance of collapse, and there's a safety issue that's involved. I'm just interested from a totally different perspective to archaeological, just a practical engineering aspect.
I have no idea why we don't do it circular. To be honest, some of the bits I dig are circular. They're not meant to be.
Conical.
Yeah, conical. Look, health and safety was nowadays we could get away with what Mike and Bert and Reece did back in the 80s.
And let me just add to that. In 1989, they dig this 4.5 metre shaft, and then in 1993, all three of them go and do a grave digger's license. I think that was on their mind. But in terms of the much better dig, we stepped in it, and the best thing you can do is to step in the hole. So you're not just digging an enormous hole. It's for as long as possible. It's supported, and then when you take away those final steps, you get out as quick as you can.
I guess in terms of sampling, both taking things from the wall and obviously working things out in square meterage and square centimetres is a far more straightforward affair than coming up with using pi or any other areas. I guess it's just been done that way for 200 years plus, so I guess that's just how it's going to start.
Thank you very much for